Welcome to Commonwealth Club World Affairs and Humanities West for our second program this year on Emma of Normandy. And I'm going to turn this program over to the person who conceived of it and executed on it, Teresa Nelson. She is the one of the three co-founders of Humanities West back in 1983 when she was not quite out of her teenage years, I think. So, Teresa Nelson is going to introduce everyone else. Thanks a lot for the whole idea and for putting this all together, Teresa.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening to hear about this incredible woman. When I read Pat Bracewell's first book, I was so entranced. I couldn't wait for the second and the third, and there's going to be a fourth. And so we were talking at a board meeting about, a Humanities West board meeting, about programs, as we do, and we always appreciate suggestions. And I said, hey, we need to do a program during Women's History Month with a woman. And I thought, oh, Emma of Normandy would be really interesting, not someone that everyone probably knows a lot about, perhaps not like Queen Elizabeth I, et cetera. So we had a great time putting this together, and I'll also be singing in between the two lectures. But let me go ahead and introduce Patricia Bracewell, who is our first speaker this evening. So Patricia Bracewell began her research for the Emma of Normandy trilogy in the library stacks of UC Berkeley and Stanford. Her research continued in France, in Denmark, and particular in Britain, where she took a course on Anglo-Saxon history at the University of Cambridge. She's attended and spoken at numerous academic conferences on medieval studies in the US and the UK, and has spoken about her novels and the history that infuses them to numerous book groups and school and other academic groups. In 2014, she served as writer-in-residence at Gladstone's Library in Wales. And in 2024, she discussed the career of Queen Emma as a guest on BBC Radio's Four's Great Lives. She's currently working on her fourth historical novel about Emma of Normandy. Please welcome Patricia Bracewell.
Oh, I can't see anyone. Hello. Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight for this program. And before I dive into Emma's life, I just want to thank Teresa Nelson and George Hammond, the Commonwealth Club and Humanities West for helping us present this glimpse into the world of Emma of Normandy. So Emma was an 11th century Queen of England until her death 50 years later. She was the only woman to be crowned Queen of England twice, as she was married first to Ethelred the Unready and second to England's Danish conqueror Canute. Her marriages and the critical decisions that she made would bind England to Normandy and eventually lead to the Norman conquest of 1066. Now, the history of that period was recorded by clerics who had very little interest in the activities of women, even queens. As a result, much of what we know about Emma has been pieced together from 11th and 12th century chronicles. However, we also have one other source known today as the Encomium Emma Regina. It was a history of events that was commissioned by Queen Emma about 10 years before she died, and it was based on information provided by the Queen herself. That act alone makes her a woman of great interest historically because no one else was doing anything quite like that in the 11th century. The stories that have come down to us from these various documents are often contradictory, sometimes dubious, and there are a great many blanks, which force us to speculate about events and about Emma's role in them. Powerful women were often viewed through a negative lens by early historians because these women acted way too much like men, and people didn't like that. Emma has been described by them as manipulative, deceitful, ruthless, and unscrupulous. Other more recent historians describe her more positively as highly intelligent, politically active, a trained diplomat, and a motherlode of power in the 11th century. I fall into that pro-Emma group. And in telling her story, I am going to be leaning toward that point of view. So here we go. Buckle your seatbelts. We're going to cover 50 years. Oh, look, it works. Emma's birth was not recorded. That is not unusual for the time. We think it was in about the year 985. She was one of 9 children, the daughter of Duke Richard, the first Duke of Normandy, and his Duchess Gunnar. Now, Richard was the grandson of a Norse Viking who had settled in Normandy in the 10th century, and Gunnar was a later arrival who was born in Denmark and then later came to Normandy. So Emma was Scandinavian on both sides. She probably spoke both French and Danish. When her father died, Emma's brother became Duke Richard II. And because Duchess Gunnar was her son's close advisor, young Emma would have witnessed firsthand her widowed mother acting as a political force. And really, that's about all we know about Emma's childhood. Her marriage to King Ethelred in the year 1002 was part of an alliance. It came about because Viking fleets had been raiding English towns and then selling their plunder in Norman markets and paying a tax to Duke Richard for the privilege. Ethelred hoped that the marriage would put an end to this practice and to the Viking raids. Duke Richard, on his side, saw it as a valuable link to one of the wealthiest and most ancient ruling dynasties in Europe, adding to his own prestige. Emma was given no voice in this decision, of course. And so she arrived in England in the spring of 1002 to marry a man who had been on the English throne for 25 years. And here he is, Ethelred. This is from a 13th century chronicle, so the man who drew this had never seen the king, although we're told that he was quite handsome. When Emma met him and married him, he was a little longer in the tooth than what you see here. He was a 34-year-old widower with 10 children, 6 of them sons. Emma was probably about 16 years old. She was the first foreign bride to wed an English king in 150 years. So her arrival would have been a dramatic and spectacular event. She would have landed at Canterbury with abundant wedding gifts and a crowd of Norman attendants. But she had a lot to learn about England, about its culture and its politics. We don't even know if she understood Old English at the time, and you'll get a taste of Old English while you're here tonight. If she did not know it on her arrival, she certainly had the capacity and the ability to learn, and we think, in fact, that Emma was probably a polyglot who spoke a number of languages. As part of her dowry, Emma received lands at Exeter and in the northeast Midlands. I've marked them here on this map, and you can see that they're very widespread. They provided income for her household. That household and the royal administration and the treasury were centered at the palace in Winchester, and of course, the Queen was its mistress. The court, of course, was also peripatetic. They moved from royal estate to royal estate all around the kingdom. And in this way, Emma became acquainted with and could form alliances with the leading nobility. It would have been a lot for a young woman of 16 or 17 to take on. It became even more difficult for Emma when that November of 1002, Ethelred ordered a massacre of the Danes who were living in England. One of those was caught up in the massacre, who was caught up in the massacre was the sister of the Danish king, Sven Forkbeard. Now, it's impossible for us to know today how Emma, with her Danish family connections, would have responded to that infamous St. Brice's Day massacre. It certainly impacted her because the next year, King Sven retaliated by ransacking and burning Exeter, which was a major source of Emma's income. Clearly, the marriage that was supposed to stifle Viking raids on England had not worked. Over the next 10 years, The Viking raids grew in number and intensity. The raiding, killing, and burning put the king and the court on a military footing, probably involving Ethelred's now teenage sons from his first marriage, but there was no role for the young queen to play in that military government. Nevertheless, Emma would have been watching, and she would have been learning. Her concerns at this time were with her younger stepchildren and with producing children of her own. Only when she gave birth to a son would she gain any real agency within the family politics that governed the realm. That, though, was a double-edged sword for Emma because while a son would give her more power, it would cause family dissension regarding the eventual succession. The idea of primogeniture did not yet exist in England at this time, so any one of Ethelred's sons could inherit the throne after his death, and Emma's stepsons would probably not have welcomed the idea of a new half-brother and possible rival. So things at court could not have been easy for the queen. That brother arrived in 1005. He was named Edward, and we know him today as Edward the Confessor. This is an image from the 13th century life of Edward. And 2 years later, his sister Godgifu was born, and in 1012, his brother Alfred arrived. Emma's wealth and significance increased with each birth, but as the repeated Viking attacks and internal political chaos slowly shredded English attempts at resistance, her focus was still on the royal household and her children and not on what was happening politically. That would change in the year 1013, and that was when the Danish king Sven, who was now bent on empire building and had trained his sights on England, attacked. Sweyn and his son Canute landed a large fleet on England's northeastern coast. It was an area known as the Danelaw. You see it marked there. And that was where successive waves of Scandinavians had settled in England over the generations. Sweyn secured the allegiance of these northerners by marrying his son Canute to the wealthy daughter of a powerful Mercian family that had a grudge against Ethelred. Her name was Elfgifu of Northampton. Remember that name. As Sven led his now massive army south, because it was a force now made up of Danes and English, one shire after another submitted, until before the end of 1013, Sven was accepted as full king. Emma and her children had to flee to her brother's court in Normandy, while the king remained for a time in England on the Isle of Wight. In this image, you see, this is another from the 13th century life of Edward. Sven is attacking while the English are being murdered or led into slavery. Emma is escaping on a horse with her sons and a retainer. It's a very long horse. Let me tell you, their departure would not have been on a horse. It would have been an enormous undertaking involving shiploads of as much movable treasure and belongings as they could take, because there was no way of knowing how long their exodus was going to last. And all of this would have been under the supervision of the queen. Once they arrived in Normandy, Emma had to persuade her brother to offer refuge not just to the royal family, but to the members of the court who fled with them. This again is from the 13th century life of Edward. We see Emma's son Edward, who was 8 at the time, and Alfred, and they're being presented to her brother. Alfred was still a babe in arms, so this isn't exactly accurate. Ethelred eventually joined them in January of 1014. Are you still with me on the dates? Although his 3 still living elder sons from his first marriage remained in England. In Normandy, Emma was likely in the very powerful position of counselor and interpreter for Ethelred, because it's doubtful that he spoke French. Things changed again very soon, because in February of 1014, messages arrived from England that King Sven had suddenly died. His son Canute was still in the north of England at the head of a large army, but he was young, barely out of his teens. This is an image from a 19th century book called Historic Boys. The English did not see him as the threat that his father had been because he was so young. And rather than offer the throne to Canute, who thought it belonged to him because his father had been king, or even to one of Ethelred's elder sons, they invited the king to return, but asked him to please rule better than he had before. He responded not by coming himself right away, but by sending his son Edward, Emma's son, to act as his representative in negotiations with the English counselors. Edward was 9 years old. This seems to imply a growing preference for Edward as Ethelred's heir, possibly promoted by Emma and her brother. It may have been a quid pro quo response to the royal families having received asylum in Normandy. It certainly seemed to affirm Emma's importance to her husband. She was with him when he returned to England to retake his throne, and the first thing that he had to do was get rid of Canute. Ethelred attacked the Danes. He surprised them that spring, and now it was Canute who was forced to flee. He did not stay away for long, though. The following year, he returned, and now he was bent on conquest, just as his father had been. By this time, it was late in 1015. Ethelred was about 57 years old, and he was sick. So it was his eldest living son, 20-something Edmund Ironside from his first marriage, who led the English forces in battle after battle against Canute over 8 months until in April of 1016, Ethelred died. Emma was with the king in London when he died, and her situation was precarious. Despite whatever promises may have been made to her about the succession, it was not her son Edward who was named king, but Edmund Ironside. And really, Edmund needed a vigorous warrior to defend the kingdom against Canute and his army, not an 11-year-old. It's hard to know what role Emma played in the turbulent months following Edmund's accession, but we have some stories. They place her usually in London, and London was under siege 3 times during this time. There's a skaldic poem that describes a chaste widow standing within London's walls, looking out on the banks of the Thames, where battles are raging and swords are covered in blood, and this may in fact be a reference to Emma. Another story from Scandinavia claimed that she sent Edward to fight beside Edmund Ironside. If that's true, she might have done it to retain some vestige of her son's status as the king's half-brother, as well as her own status and her claim to her estates as Dowager Queen. Of course, that was assuming that Edmund Ironside won, but he did not. In October of 1016, he lost at the Battle of Assendon, and he was forced to divide the kingdom in half, with Canute taking the north, including London, while Edmund held the wealthier south. A month later, though, Edmund too died, and Canute seized control of the entire realm. Now things were even more dicey than before for the queen and for her children. Edward was 11, Godgifu was 9, and Alfred was 4. She sent them to safety in Normandy, but there are dubious and conflicting reports about where Emma was and about how her marriage to Canute, which would take place in mid-1017, actually came about. A German chronicler, writing in 1018, the following year, said that Emma was frantic to escape London, so she bribed Canute for her release by handing over unimaginable amounts of plunder, as well as delivering her sons to him to be executed, and he named those sons Edmund and Athelstan, not Edward and Alfred, who were her actual sons. And in fact, Athelstan was one of Ethelred's sons, and by the way, he had died 2 years before. So this was really kind of mixed up. And because of the difficulty of the names, the amount of plunder that he cites, and the fact that Emma's children were already in Normandy, this tale may have come from garbled rumors that reached Germany some months after Canute's conquest. Still, it was a juicy story about a powerful, wealthy, ambitious, and heartless queen, and it may be one reason why later historians portrayed Emma as unscrupulous and ruthless, willing to give away her sons for her own safety. We also have the version of events written by Emma's encomiast. He completely ignores her 15-year marriage to Ethelred and her life in England. He has Canute searching the world over for the perfect bride, finding a queen in Normandy who fit the bill, and wooing her with promises and gifts. It's very romantic. This 19th century painting by the Danish artist Lawrence Frolic, which is one of several depicting the Danish conquest of England, seems to agree with the encomiast's version of how the marriage came about. It's a charming and romantic image. I'm not sure what the dogs at Emma's feet seem to symbolize. It might be perhaps hinting at a certain amount of coercion, which is quite possible because the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entry for 1017 reports that Canute had Ethelred's widow fetched so he could have her as his queen. It does not say where she was fetched from. It doesn't even give her name, although it does sound as if she might have been in the next room. The likeliest scenario is that Emma did not go to Normandy, but took a calculated risk and remained in London. She had properties in England, she had the income from them, she had relationships with the clergy and the members of the nobility who were still alive after all the years of bloodshed. She was a queen of England, and she could offer herself to the new king as a peace weaver. If things didn't go her way, she could join her children in Normandy later. Canute, of course, on his side, would have realized that as his queen, she would be a close personal contact who knew the court and its key players. She understood law codes. She understood the coinage, the church. She even spoke Danish. Also, if he married her, he would not have to worry that her brother in Normandy might one day support efforts by her sons to reclaim the English throne. So, sounds like a good situation for both of them. But there was this little problem. You remember Ælfgifu? Canute already had a wife, and Emma knew it. Ælfgifu was probably in Denmark at this time, and while it would have been easy for Canute to set aside that first liaison, English and Danish kings did this all the time. Ælfgifu had given Canute 2 sons. They were named Sven and Harold, and it was those sons and their claims upon their father's throne that worried Emma. According to the encomiast, Emma refused to agree to marry Canute until he swore that only a son that she gave him would inherit his throne. Was she really in a position to make this kind of demand? Well, she had about 8 months to persuade him, and she could have called on the clergy to back her up. The archbishops were powerful, and Canute needed their support. As for how Canute and Emma regarded each other at this time, her encomiast wrote this, I quote, "It is hard to credit how vast a magnitude of delight in one another arose in them both. For the king rejoiced that he had unexpectedly entered upon a most noble marriage. The lady, on the other hand, was inspired both by the excellence of her husband and by the delightful hope of future offspring." Let's remember that this is Emma's point of view. We should probably take it with a little grain of salt. I suspect it was not all sweetness and light at this time, and there were difficult negotiations conducted. But however it came about, the marriage took place at last with full Christian rites and a coronation for Emma. She had indeed landed on her feet. She was about 32 years old, and she was married to a king who was at least 5 years younger than she was instead of 20 years older. And it appears that she and Canute did indeed form a bond of personal admiration and a close working relationship. The following year, in 1018, Emma gave birth to her son, Harthacnut. Their daughter, Gunhild, was born 2 years later. The 17 years of Canute's reign would be the period of Emma's greatest power and influence. She was a queen who exercised patronage in a prosperous kingdom that was peaceful at last after decades of bloodshed and war. One chronicler claimed that while Canute was campaigning in foreign lands, Emma handed out treasure with holy prodigality. She was an energetic patron of the church, often in conjunction with the king. She was a giver of offices and lands, of textiles and manuscripts. Today, if you go to the Cathedral Museum at York, you can see the York Gospels. It was a book manuscript that Canute gave to York's archbishop early in his reign, and I would bet money that Emma had a hand in that. We have a good example of the couple's generosity in this contemporary image from the Liber Vitae of Winchester's New Minster. You'll be hearing more about that manuscript from Professor Traherne when she speaks. But briefly, you can see that Emma and Canute are placing a massive gold cross on the church's altar. Note that they're both at the same level. This drawing implies an equal partnership between king and queen. They look like an 11th century power couple. Perhaps the most public display of Emma's role as queen and peace weaver took place in the year 1023, when the remains of Saint Alphay, a Canterbury archbishop who had been murdered by the Danes back in 1012, were removed from London and over 8 days transported to Canterbury. It was Emma and her 5-year-old son Harthacnut, not the king, who accompanied the remains to their new tomb amid a crowd of singing and praying worshipers. Emma's participation can be seen here as a symbol of conciliation between the Danes who had murdered the archbishop and the English who had sanctified him. And Harthacnut's very public presence can be seen as recognition of this son as the legitimate heir apparent to the English throne, as opposed to Ælfgifiu's sons. 3 years later, though, things changed again. In 1026, Canute, who was now king of Denmark as well as England, took 8-year-old Harthacnut to Roskilde, where the boy was designated as Denmark's future king. Emma may have been worried about whether her son was still in line for the English throne, because Ælfgifiu and her sons were still around, although we're not sure where they were. They weren't at the English court, but they were somewhere in England. Emma's sons by Ethelred were still at the ducal court in Normandy, and their sister Godgifu was wed to a Norman count. It is impossible to know if Emma had any communication with her children in Normandy. As Canute's queen, direct contact with her sons would have been risky. But certainly she would have heard of them through her vast web of family and ecclesiastical connections. And speaking of ecclesiastical connections, in 1027, this may surprise you, Canute went to Rome to hang out with the Pope for a couple of weeks. He attended the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II. While he was there, he may have begun arranging the future marriage of his 7-year-old daughter, Gunhild, to Conrad's 10-year-old son, Henry. Did Emma have a say in these marriage plans for her daughter? You'd think she would want to. Was she with Canute in Rome? There is no proof that she was, although since women were so rarely mentioned in the annals, it's not completely impossible. I have to tell you, if my husband was going to go off and attend an emperor and an empress's coronation, I would want to tag along. Still, it is likely that she stayed in England because Canute's empire now included not just Denmark, but also Norway and bits of Sweden. And during his frequent absences, Emma was his eyes and ears in the English court. She may have been co-regent with the powerful Earl Godwin at this time. 3 years later, in 1030, Canute's first wife Ælfgifu enters the story again, when Canute sends her, along with their eldest son Svein, to rule for him in Norway. That lasted 5 years until they had to flee when the Norse rebelled. The Norse did not like being ruled by the Danes. They fled to Denmark, which was ruled now by Emma's 17-year-old son Harthacnut, but Svein, who was in his 20s, died there. And that same year, 1035, Canute too died at Shaftesbury Abbey on 12 November. He was in his early 40s. Emma was a dowager queen now for the second time, and she was probably about 50 years old. Canute's unexpected death, though, meant that he hadn't named an heir, and now 2 of his sons, each one by a different wife, had a claim to the English throne, not to mention Emma's 2 sons over in Normandy with their own claims. The queen was in Winchester, in control of the royal treasury and protected by Canute's hearthguards. She insisted that her son Harthacnut was the rightful heir to the kingdom. She sent word to her son of Canute's death, And he was stuck in Denmark, fighting the Norse still. He couldn't get away. Canut's other son, though, 21-year-old Harold, was right there in England. He is known today as Harold Harefoot, and he was quick to insist that he was his father's heir. He sent armed men to Winchester, where they seized the royal treasure from Emma. I can't imagine that this happened without a fight, or that Emma didn't manage to squirrel away some of Canut's private loot, and there was probably plenty of that. But while Harold did have supporters in the north, nobody in the south seems to have heard of him. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle claimed, I quote, "Harold said that he was the son of Canute and of Ælfgifu, the Hampshire lady, though it was thought very incredible by many men." Emma's encomiast would go further and claim that Harold wasn't Canute's son at all, but the child of a servant that Ælfgifu passed off as Canute's son, and that he had no legitimate claim to the throne, whatever. Well, in 1036, Ælfgifu herself returned to England to back up her son's claim. She and Harold had support from her northern kin group, in particular her cousin Leofric, the powerful Earl of Mercia. His wife is someone you might recognize, Lady Godiva. Ælfgifu tried to get support for her son by throwing huge feasts, bribing the nobles with gifts and money, and demanding that they swear oaths of loyalty to herself and to Harold. Meantime, Emma and Hartha Canute's supporters down in the south included Earl Godwin and the very powerful Archbishop of Canterbury. When at one point Harold summoned the Archbishop and demanded a full coronation or else, the Archbishop placed the royal regalia on the altar at Canterbury and said that while the sons of Queen Emma lived, he would not consecrate any other man as king. So what we have here is a crisis of family politics, and it would soon explode into a bloody battle royal. A council was held at Oxford to decide what to do. We're not sure when it was held, sometime in 1036. Hartha Canute was the leading candidate, but he was still stuck in Denmark fighting the Norse. So despite heated objections from Emma and Earl Godwin, the council decided to divide England until Hartha Canute arrived. Harold would be regent for his brother in the north, while Emma and Godwin would be his regents in the south. Nobody was satisfied. Harold still wanted to rule all of England, and it must have been a difficult and tense time while everyone waited impatiently for Hartha Canute to show up. Emma held court at the palace in Winchester, surrounded by servants and royal huscarls. She would have been deeply involved at this time in preparations for the wedding of her 16-year-old daughter Gunhild to Emperor Conrad's son, Henry, who was king of Germany at this time. It would take place in Germany in June of 1036. Emma would have had her own experience as a young foreign bride to draw on in order to help prepare her daughter for what she would be facing at the imperial court. But there was no question of Emma attending the wedding in Germany because things in England were way too fractious. Meanwhile, over in Normandy, Emma's sons by Ethelred knew that Canute was dead and that the throne was up for grabs. In the autumn of 1036, they each sailed to England from different ports. Edward landed at Southampton, was confronted by a hostile force, had a fight, and then afterwards went back to Normandy. Alfred tried to land in Kent, but he too found troops waiting for him, so he sailed further along the coast. When he finally landed, he was met by Earl Godwin, Emma's ally, who gave his company lodging. But Godwin, who would later claim that now he was following the orders of Harold Harefoot, left the Normans unguarded, and during the night, Harold's men attacked them. Most of Alfred's company were killed, and he was taken to East Anglia, where he was tried as an invader. His eyes were put out, and he died of his injuries. He was 25 years old. There is still a mystery about what prompted Emma's sons to sail to England with armed supporters, what role Emma played, and what role Godwin played in Alfred's death. Once again, there were conflicting stories. Emma's encomiast would claim that Harold had sent a letter to her sons in Normandy, a forgery, supposedly from her, to purposefully draw them to England and murder them, thus narrowing the field of rivals for the throne. He even quotes the entire letter, which ends by instructing them to send back word by the same messenger about what they plan to do. Was the encomiast telling the truth? Did Harold forge that letter and have someone carry it to Normandy? Many historians today suggest that Emma was desperate enough to actually write that letter or one like it. And because of the horrible outcome, Alfred's death, she persuaded her encomiast, who was writing some 6 years later, to pin the blame on Harold. If she did write it, she was trying to retain her power and position the only way she could as a woman, through her sons. But if she invited them to England without having any means to support their claim, then she was either blindly optimistic, or she had been lied to by her supporters, like Godwin, who switched sides, or by putting her ambitions before the well-being of her sons, she was being politically immoral. There are some, though, including me, who believe that Emma was too politically savvy to have written that letter. She must have known that the sons of Ethelred had very few supporters in England at this time, and that it would be suicide for them to attempt a coup. That letter could well have been forged by Harold or someone close to him. It fits in with his threats against the archbishop and his raid on the queen's treasury. If he'd managed to get his hands on Emma's seal, that might have inspired just such a plan. And it strikes me as very suspicious that there were armed troops waiting for the athelings when they landed. It's also possible that Emma's sons did not need any letter to draw them to England and to the possibilities that they imagined might be there for them. And that letter might have been invented by the encomiast to just throw shade on Harold's memory and to clear Emma from any rumors that her actions might have led to her son's death. We can't prove anything one way or the other. The jury will forever be out on Emma's culpability here. This is another example of how complicated this history is and how much we do not know. But Alfred's murder at Harold's hands quelled any opposition to his rule. Emma's supporters drifted away, and Harold Harefoot was crowned. In 1037, Emma was driven out of England, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, without any pity against the raging winter. Emma still had some resources, though. She sailed to Bruges, no doubt with attendants and with enough treasure to support herself. The Duke of Flanders was her relative by marriage, and he gave her a place to live that was suited to her position as queen. 11th century Bruges was a smart choice on Emma's part. It was a busy crossroads where she could hear news of events in England, Normandy, France, Germany, and Britain. In 1039, she would have learned of the death of her daughter, Queen Gunhild, Henry's wife, who at age 19 died in Italy during a pestilence. Emma's other daughter, Godgifu, was now Countess of Boulogne, and that's not far from Bruges. It's possible that she visited her mother while she was there, and she was there for 3 years. Certainly, Edward met with her in Bruges because she sent for him. Her encomiast implies that the queen asked Edward to help her avenge Alfred's murder by King Harold. But Edward said he couldn't help and that she should ask Harthacnut. And so once again, she sent messages to Harthacnut. And now, finally, he was able to respond to her pleas. In 1040, he joined her in Bruges, and he brought along a large fleet, just in case of an invasion of England should prove necessary. While they were getting reacquainted, and this was over a number of weeks, word arrived that over in England, Harold Harefoot had very conveniently died. Once again, the English nobles, probably very aware of Harthacnut's massive fleet and more than a little nervous about it, invited Harthacnut to come and take the throne. According to the encomium, Emma and her son were welcomed to England with open arms. It probably wasn't that simple or that friendly. There were scores to be settled and an atheling's death to avenge. The English were taxed heavily to support Harthacnut's fleet. Harold's body was dug up from its grave and thrown into the Thames, and his mother, Queen Elfgifu, disappeared from history. The following year, 1041, probably at Emma's suggestion, Harthacnut invited Edward to England to share rule with him. And now Emma would have exercised considerable power. She was the mother of 2 kings, neither of whom had spent any time in England for more than a decade, and neither of whom had a wife. She would have been very active in her role as Queen Mother. And it was at this time that her encomium enshrining her legacy was written in Latin and probably read aloud for entertainment in the palace, translated as it was read to English, Flemish, Norman, and Danish listeners who made up the court at this time. This is the cover of the encomium from the years early 1040s. You see Emma at the center. You see the encomiast on his knees offering up his book. Her children, her 2 sons, are peeking in from the side, but it is Emma in the crown on that massive throne with a gown that has gems all the way down the front. She is the queen enthroned in majesty. But things changed again in 1042. Harthacnut died at age 24. This time, Emma had made sure that her son Edward was right there at hand and ready to rule. He was crowned at Easter in 1043, but Edward was 37 years old, and he didn't want any more help from his mother. Thank you very much. Also, he had an axe to grind. Soon after his coronation, he and 3 of his earls attacked Emma at Winchester. He took her treasure, he confiscated her land holdings, leaving her only enough income for her needs, and he ordered her to stay put in Winchester and away from court. This very act seems to indicate that Emma was still the hub of power. It took a king, 3 earls, and their retainers to grab it from her. Edward would later claim that she had withheld land and treasure from him and that she had done less for him than he wished, both before he was king and after. So we have to ask ourselves, how far back did his resentment against his mother go? As far back as 1016, when she kept her crown by marrying Canute while she sent her sons off to Normandy? The truth is that Emma made the best bargain with Canute that she could for herself and for her offspring. She probably saved their lives. Or was Edward resentful that when Canute finally died, she had tried to place Harthacnut on the throne instead of him? Again, whatever Edward believed, in 1035, Emma recognized that only a son of Canute's would be accepted as king. And it was Emma who, when the coast was clear at last, brought Edward to England to share in his brother's reign and saw him crowned king in 1043. Really? How sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child. Edward is not one of my favorites. He eventually repented of his actions against his mother because a year later, she was back at court witnessing charters. She may have had a hand in arranging Edward's marriage to Earl Godwin's daughter in 1045. But with the new queen on the throne, it was time for Emma to step away. At roughly 60 years old, she retired to her property in Winchester. 7 years later, on 6 March 1052, Emma died. And she was buried in Winchester beside Canute and Harthacnut. Her remains and those of other Anglo-Saxon royals were eventually placed in mortuary chests in the 12th century Norman cathedral high atop stone screens. The names of the interred were inscribed on those chests, and the only woman among them is Queen Emma. But her story does not stop here. In 1642, during the English Civil War, a troop of parliamentary soldiers who hated everything royal entered the cathedral, pulled down the chests, and scattered the bones. When the remains were gathered up and returned to the chests, they were hopelessly jumbled. Now let us fast forward to 2012, when a team of scientists and archaeologists opened those 6 chests and examined the 1,300 bones they found inside. They were able to sort them, and they identified 23 individuals. Only one was the partial damaged skeleton of a woman. Using 3D printing, an accurate copy of that skeleton was made and is now on display in the Winchester Cathedral Museum. The results of that study which lasted for many years, will be published this year, later in the year. Will it confirm that these are the remains of Queen Emma and complete her story? I'm told that paleopathologists are unlikely to verify that these are Emma's bones until they see DNA proof similar to what was provided in identifying the remains of Richard III that you may recall were buried under a car park. I am not so skeptical. We know that Emma was buried at Winchester and that her name was inscribed on that mortuary chest beneath its crown. Of all the people in those chests, she was the only woman and the only person who had been in a position of power as Queen Consort, Queen Dowager, or Queen Mother for 50 years. Who else could possibly be in there? Thank you. Careful. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, a stunning accounting of this amazing woman. There we go. How's that? So, in true Humanities West tradition, we like to have lectures and performances along with visual arts to create a truly interdisciplinary experience. And so for the second part of tonight's program, following on Pat's incredible recounting of this amazing woman's life, I mean, she had at least 10 or 12 different lives, more than the average cat. And we have some music for you that's from sort of around Emma's period. We'll call it Emma adjacent. And I'll be joined by several colleagues of mine from a group called In Boca al Lupo, In the Mouth of the Wolf. And we will be led by Shira Kamen, whom some of you have seen here before at Humanities West. I should say that Shira was part of the very first Humanities West program in 1984 that was on Venice. And she's been at a number of Humanities West programs over the years. Please welcome back Shira Kamen and In Boca al Lupo.
Break a leg.
Thank you. I'm a little horrified about the 1984 part. That seems like a long time ago. But I did want to say that it's been an honor and delight to be involved with this organization for that long. And thank you, Teresa and George and everybody who's kept it alive. I'm so glad it's still happening. And one of the great challenges of having a subject that you know nothing about and then trying to find music to match with it, particularly a subject such as this, is we basically have no music from this period. That said, Gregorian chant was codified around 900, so we have little cells of melody, but we don't have anything where we have a song, a text with music. So we're going to present, as Teresa said, an Emma adjacent concert, starting with music slightly later. We'll start with a 13th century Northern French piece, and then we'll hearken back to a piece by Hildegard von Bingen, who was born about 30 years after Emma died. The first piece is called O Lilium Convallium. The lily was associated with all sorts of things, including the Virgin Mary, and of course then turned into a big symbol of royalty in France with the fleur-de-lis. Uh-oh.
Oh, wisdom, who, circling, circle, enclosing all in one life-giving path. 3 wings you have. One soars to the heights, one distills its essence upon the earth, and the third is everywhere. Praise to you as is fitting, O wisdom.
Dealing with the technology is the scariest part of all this. I think, I'm going to drop it. I can't figure out how to put the stand up. So even more mysterious than the absence of much written music with text as we move back in time is the role of instruments in this music. This was predominantly an oral art. It's way before we have anything that says, cello plays this line, or instrumental parts written out at all. So we're doing mostly, not entirely, but mostly monophonic music, single line music. And so part of the challenge of playing medieval instrumental music is trying to accompany pieces where you don't have enough information to do that. So it's a good challenge, a good jigsaw puzzle. I'm going to play, there's very few instrumental pieces left from the early Middle Ages. And I'll play a very short Danish medieval song, which I found the other day. I was going to play something else, and I thought, oh, it's Danish. It was thought to be written around the 13th century. There is a text, which I'm not going to do, which is apparently written in runes, which is mighty cool. And then after I play that piece, we'll morph into a 3-part piece from a manuscript called the Codex Calixtinus, associated with the whole Santiago de Compostela pilgrimage. This is apparently one of the earliest 3-part pieces, and the text is in praise of the faithful rejoicing together. Sorry. Emma would have known how to deal with this stuff. And finally, we come to the most scary and most perilous part of our program. We've taken the text of a strange and wonderful poem from the Exeter book from the time of Emma of Normandy, The Wife's Lament. It's in Old English, which is a language new to all of us, Some of you may know this language. Apologies in advance. And our experiment is this. We've taken the poem, which of course is just text. We've made some musical decisions about the various sections of it, including little cells of melody or modes we might use. And within this structure, we are going to improvise the music to The Wife's Lament. Thanks to our esteemed slide show poet back there, who will scroll through the poem as we make our way through it. It's walking away from me. Ich disse du recca mi befoglie morre Minner silfare sith each that saith in my What each warp thy bad sith an each ubwex Ne we so the elles no my phone
dat monis machas huchan, hoek doene je vocht, dat hij totaal de monk, dat with je widows den world richer, lief onlauflich kost, und make longer. oft meg herafel begjært from sitt frean. Frusint on erdun, leve livende, leve werdiar. Zonne ich on uchtan anagonga, under actreo, jond das erdstravel.
There each sitter mot sundandal, there each raven mig mine roxitas, fått hela, för don each evrene mig, der mod kjære mindre gerestan, ne elestas longates, det meg om visum life begjært. Oh, surely, young man, wisdom, give order. Arreton jeto, sysche habanchul, blithen jaboro, exambre shoro, signor jedre. Sorokin sinfonielong, healed his wounded wing. Sie voll wiederfach verras Vogelmondes, dat min frei und sitteth, und es anfließe Storme beriemet, when a weary mood water beflowen on your sailor, Dreo yeth tussen min winne, Mitchle modchere.
Thank you so much. It was a really incredible journey, both learning the Old English, which, as you can see, doesn't sound exactly like it looks, and then having the chance to improvise this with Shira was really very special. So we are now about to be joined by Professor Elaine Traherne. She is unable to be here in person, and she is going to be with us on Zoom. She is the Senior Associate Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education at Stanford. She is the Roberta Bowman Denning Professor of Humanities and Professor of English, also the Robert K. Packard University Fellow in Undergraduate Education, and the Director of Stanford's Text Technologies Program. She is the author of Disrupting Categories, 1050 to 1250, Thinking Through Humanities with Pre-Modern Texts, and Perceptions of Medieval Manuscripts, The Phenomenal Book. Please welcome Dr. Elaine Traherne.
Okay, I'm hoping you can hear me. And I should be screen sharing. And I'm assuming that somebody will do something if things get a little bit wobbly, because I can only really see my screen. And is it, hang on, we haven't gone from start. Okay, good. All right, I'm taking my time. Sorry, so I've got this terrible cold and I'm prone to spasms of terrible coughing, and I'm really hoping that that's not going to happen in the next 35 to 40 minutes. And that's why I'm not with you today. I didn't want to stand at the podium and sputter all over the place. So I do apologise, and the programme has been really wonderful so far. And I really want to congratulate Patricia on an extraordinarily clear presentation of Emma's life. And then the musicians were wonderful, and I do teach Old English, and I've edited and translated The Wife's Lament in my Old English anthology, and that was just an exceptional piece of musical work at the end of that programme. The whole thing was beautiful, but to have The Wife's Lament, which is a European phenomenon of lamenting women's songs, to have it sung by women to the accompaniment of the harp like that, is really very special, and I'm very moved and want to congratulate all of you on that performance. So I'm going to talk really about sort of manuscripts and cultures of literacy, and I'm going to obviously dwell on Emma, but I'm going to provide some context first. And I think it's really difficult to, in terms of what survives, to separate Emma and Knut, her second husband, out as individual players. And so I'm really glad that Patricia's given us that wonderful sort of introduction to Emma, because, as she said, they were a power couple, and they appear as a power couple all the way through both of their respective lives. I think up until Emma's death, she's still very much the sort of dowager queen, and that shows in the evidence that we have. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the sources that Patricia also mentioned, and as I say, sort of put them in a broader material context of manuscripts in this period, but also in a broader political and intellectual, cultural and ecclesiastical context, European-wide. So thank you to everyone for putting up with me being on Zoom, and for all of the organisation. And I'm really delighted to be here, even if only in this odd capacity. So medieval manuscripts, as I'm sure many of you know, are of the most enormous significance in allowing us to reconstruct the medieval period, both from the texts that they provide, from the images that they often have within them, from the techniques and methods that were used in their production, and from their sort of long history and sequentiality. So really, Western manuscripts begin sort of in the Roman period, of course, but we're talking medieval, so it's sort of 450 to 1500 or thereabouts. And for this entire period, most medieval manuscripts in the West were made from animal skins, as I'm sure you know, and we have this wonderful sequence of illuminated capital letters from a 12th century German manuscript in front of us on the screen here, which shows us the ways in which medieval manuscripts were produced in this kind of very cleaned up kind of way, with a monk at the top left going to a parchment maker and buying the sheet of parchment hot off the frame, as you can see just in the middle of the picture, the parchment, the animal skin, calf, deer, goat, sheep, pinned to a frame, and then cut off that frame. And he buys this piece of parchment, and in the second image on the left, the same monk, I think, with his hood down, is ruling the manuscript page. And then in the third image, somebody else has come along and is beginning to write the material. So the fact that they've all got halos does suggest that they are religious figures meant to illustrate religious figures. And in the two images on the right-hand side, we have words, it looks like they're being dictated from one person on the left to another person on the right. And then at the bottom right, you have an illustration of an illustrator who appears to be illustrating himself, illustrating in the manuscript. And this shows us how manuscripts are put together, and the way that these are framed by these illuminated, embellished initials in a manuscript is a sort of self-referential indication of the value and the expense and the skill that was required in putting these manuscripts together. And this is really beautifully illustrated also in the 12th century, around 1155, in the Eadwina Psalter, which is a very famous manuscript now in Cambridge Trinity College. And this is a picture of a master scribe at work. He is Eadwina Scriptorum Princeps, the prince of all scribes. And you can see from the tools in his left and his right hand he has his quill, and in the left hand he has his knife, and his knife allows him to erase mistakes, but also to hold the lively manuscript page down. And you can see how extraordinary the setting is for the production of a manuscript, like the Eadwine of Salta itself, richly illuminated. And if we just have a look at a close-up of his hands in action, you know, this is an incredibly skilled, advanced form of literacy that we're witnessing here, and also form of illustration. And not all manuscripts are as richly illuminated as the Eadwine of Salta or some of the others that we're going to look at. But there's no doubt about the skill of the scribes in this period, and especially around the period of Knut and Emma's reigns. Actually, from about 960 to about 1050, the production of manuscripts in Anglo-Saxon England was at its height. And many of our most important books come from this period. And we already just heard about one, the Exeter Book of Old English Poetry, from which the Wife's Lament was taken in that performance we just heard. This manuscript contains over 100 poems in Old English. This is Old English script in front of us here. And this is a particular riddle, riddle 26. It starts with the M on the left-hand side, 5 lines down, you can see a capital M, and it extends to the end of the first line on the right-hand side. This is one text, one riddle, all about the making of a manuscript book. And this tells us, this particular riddle, I think everything we need to know about how important written culture, written artistic, intellectual culture was to the Anglo-Saxons, who certainly over my 30 years of teaching, when I've sat down to teach first years who've just come straight in from school and have never done medieval history or medieval literature, if you ask them about the Anglo-Saxons, really these are a vague group of ancient peoples, and they're not really sure how to sort of sift them out. But they don't really anticipate the levels of intellectual and cultural achievement that we're seeing in front of us here tonight from these early people. So this riddle is the riddle of the Gospel book. And I can tell you that it's the riddle of the Gospel book, but there's no answer to the riddle in the manuscript itself. There's no title. There's no answer to what this object is called. And this is the poem. It's 2 slides long. So it's a little bit shorter than the Wife's Lament. And it's the book itself that is talking. And it's talking about its creation from the beginning. Mech fender sum fera besnuthede, world stringer benom, wata sithan, dufde on watra, difte efthonan, sette on sunan, fair each switha beleas, herum tham, the each hafte, heard mitch sithan snar seax's edge, syndrome begrundrun. Fingras faildan, on mech fules win, ye on spedropum spurida yenecha, of a brune breerd, beam talia sweal, stremas dela, stop eft on mech, sithada sweatlas, and so on. So it talks about the preparation of the skin, being set out in the hair and deprived of the skin's hairs, cleaned of its flaws, and then how the skin is folded to create pages. And the bird's delight is the quill, and it's making tracks of ink in writing across the book. Then it's decorated with the ornamental wire work of smiths, often in gold, as we'll see. And what the book is trying to tell us here is much more than simply it's a master craft and it's an incredible production. It's also telling us that because it's a gospel book, that if people read it, if people make use of it and enjoy it, if min bean wera brucan willath, it tells us in line 4 on this slide, he beirthia sundran on the sea fastran, they'll be safer and more sure of victory. They'll be much richer in their friendships, dearer and closer. In other words, if you ingest the message of the Gospels through reading this book, you will effectively be saved. At the end, the book says, ask what I am called, a service to people. My name is famous, bountiful to men, and itself holy. And the Exeter book itself has become part of UNESCO's Memory of the World programme. It's regarded as that important, because all of the manuscripts, all of the poems that survive in this manuscript survive more or less uniquely. And it itself was clearly put together as a presentation volume using an incredibly fine scribe but not the pigments and the materials that we often see in illuminated manuscripts. And those themselves could be quite the opposite of what this book claims to be bringing, which is salvation, because even so, it's a dangerous business producing books. Hang on, I'll just forget that. It's a dangerous business producing books. Some of the materials that were used, like white lead, were obviously to do the faces and the bodies of the people in this illuminated manuscript, were themselves deeply toxic and likely to kill anyone who eventually who spent a great deal of time putting these books together using these materials. Or similarly, the red in medieval manuscripts is sometimes made of cinnabar, and the little droplets that you can see in this close-up here of the red in a manuscript, the little droplets are mercury, obviously, therefore, deadly. And so books, as well as being kind of tools of salvation, if you like, through the texts that they contain or the images that you can look at, if you're seeking salvation and wisdom in any of the great sort of faiths based on books throughout the world, this is what books are for, is to provide you with the means to attain salvation. And they are also, in some of the materials that they used, actually deadly to the people who put them together. But the scribes would have the skill and the know-how to deal with these materials, I think. And what is clear from the cinnabar or the white lead and its preparation, or the preparation of the animal skin, or the making of the ink from oak galls, which are wasps' nests in oak trees, crushed and then added a little bit of liquid and ferrous sulfate makes a medieval ink. Stanford's a great place to collect oak galls if you're interested in trying your hand at that. What's really clear is the level of skill and know-how and craft that is involved in putting together these materials in any period, and obviously here just focusing on the medieval. But also, as the riddle suggests, there's something about piety and spirituality, the work of God, that is an integral part, has an integral part to play in the production of the book. And if you've seen any of the exhibitions, there have been a number of touring exhibitions. I think a few years ago we had the Tudors exhibition, I think it was at the Legion of Honor. And in the United Kingdom, they've had the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and next year it's the Bayeux Tapestry exhibition. And there is much more to learn about these materials when one goes to see the objects in the flesh, as it were, in their exhibition cases. So the value that's placed upon these materials at their time of production, and particularly the spiritual value and the value of the piety that is put into the making of these materials, should be at the forefront of the way in which we understand the medieval manuscript. And so we have lots of evidence of that. Something like this, for example, which is on display in the British Museum, is the Brandon plaque. And this is likely to have been made specifically to go onto the binding, the covers of a gospel book, or perhaps just the Gospel of St. John. And obviously this is the emblem of St. John, his spiritual emblem of the eagle. And it tells us, you could read the words Sancta Evangelista Johannes in those quite angular letter forms. And we see the act of writing the gospel itself as the eagle St. John holds in his right hand, the large quill pen that he'll use to articulate the word of God. So the written word then comes in many forms. This plaque suggests a much larger kind of board. So this would have been a good-sized gospel book. Often quite, heavy books to carry around. And the forms in which they survive could be very varied indeed. And this is one of my all-time favorites I'm just about to show you. This is St. Rupert's Psalter. That's my hand holding it. And you can see that this is basically, it's a 2-inch by 2-inch book. And it's like a perfect kind of cube. And it contains the Psalter, and it was written for Bishop Rupert of Salzburg in the 9th century. And you can see that it's illuminated and written in the, here you can see what's called rustic capitals. And then the whole of the text is there and would have been written with a very, very thin, tiny quill. And he could fit this into the palm of his hand and carry it around with him, obviously very easily, but also hold it close. He could hold it close in an act of personal devotion and personal study of the Psalms, assuming his eyesight was up to it, because it really is quite difficult to read. I have an exact replica of it, which I use in teaching, and it's a remarkable thing. And its binding is something also spectacular. Its binding, as you can see, is miniature oak boards with this open Coptic binding, it's called. It's really just an incredible object of supplication, of veneration, and of worship. And this Book of the Psalms was very, very important to all worshippers in this period. Now, other illuminated manuscripts on which I'll spend very little time because I think you're probably familiar with them, but just to kind of contextualize what we're going to talk about in relation to Emma. The Lindisfarne Gospels, circa 700 or thereabouts, perhaps a tiny little bit earlier than that. One of the most famous illuminated manuscripts in the world and regarded as a national treasure in the United Kingdom. The carpet page here of St. John in Principio Erat Verbum, with that kind of illuminated writing on the right-hand side, which is like stained glass, if you like, and on the left-hand side, the carpet page with a cross of Christ in the middle, and those four symbolic boxes of geometric illumination to the left and the right, upper and lower registers, and just hold that abstract pattern in your heads for the rest of the lecture, because it is significant. That kind of the abstraction on this carpet page, this richly decorated carpet page, is really important as we move through this material. Lindisfarne Gospel, of course, created as an act of absolute devotion to God, with this rich kind of tapestry of interwoven animals. The whole of creation is included in this manuscript. It's meant to be contemplated and looked at again. And it's meant to permit you to experience spiritual depth in that contemplation that you undertake. And similar to the Lindisfarne Gospels, and again, I'm sure many of you know this, is the Book of Kells, a book that's now really, it's either was written and it's made perhaps in Iona or on the east coast of England, northeast coast of England, or in Ireland, and it's at Trinity College Dublin, where it has a whole huge exhibition area devoted to it. Rather, it's also Memory of the World UNESCO object, and one of Ireland's main tourist attractions, in fact, which is really interesting, similar to the Lindisfarne Gospels, these rich kind of illuminations and depictions. Every single one of them carries some kind of meaning, even if that meaning is to insist upon you slowing down, becoming mindful, contemplative, and thinking on the richness of God's creation. So from the earliest kind of period that when writing was used in Anglo-Saxon England, which really is from the 5th century onwards, and evidence survives in increasing numbers as the century goes past, writing really is very significant. And this is something that Canute and Emma really recognized, and Anglo-Saxon kings and Anglo-Scandinavian kings in the case of Canute and Arthur Canute, they really understood the importance of the written word, both as a kind of propaganda exercise, but also to ensure your place in posterity and to provide you with political clout on a stage that was wider than just your country. And we know that writing was considered of huge significance from many, many different sources of evidence, including, for example, a charter from King Aethelred, first husband of Emma, to one of his noblemen, Aethelwig. And the charter, written in 995, tells us that whatever is transacted by men of this world to endure forever ought to be fortified securely with ranks of letters, seris literatum firmite muniri debita, because the frail memory of men in dying forgets what the writing of the letters preserves and retains. Evidence like this of the importance of writing comes also from books like the Codex Ireaeus, which was made in the mid-8th century, probably in Canterbury, and it's richly illuminated with gold, as you can see. And then you can see sort of smaller writing around the frame of the illumination, and that's an inscription by Alfred, the Ealdman of Surrey, and Werburg, his wife, because this book was stolen by the Vikings from Canterbury and was ransomed by Alfred and Werburg, his wife, in order to help cleanse their souls. So this little inscription on the left says, I, Alfred Alderman Werburgh, my wife, have ransomed or redeemed this book from the heathen army with our clean money, with our pure money. What they really wanted in this inscription was to be remembered in eternity. And that's a theme, I think, running through much of the material that I work on, and certainly that had anything to do with Knut and Emma in their respective reigns. When we see Werburgh being mentioned as the companion here in the purchasing back of this book from the heathen army, we might begin to understand that women played a role both in the production of books, in the reading of books, and in the writing of books, as patrons of the arts, as Patricia mentioned in relation to Emma specifically. And books do survive. That I would certainly claim that this was written by a woman, a nun at Shaftesbury Cathedral. It's now known as the Salisbury Psalter because it's at Salisbury Cathedral. It's a later 10th century book of Psalms in Latin with an Old English gloss that was written around 1100 above the Latin. And something that I realized in studying this manuscript, it's a beautiful illustrated book of Psalms that's been terribly kind of vandalized by somebody who cut out most of the illustrated initials. But this one survives, and this one actually shows a woman in the margin chatting away to a trio of dragons. But next to the woman in black ink is in this forms the letter N. The illustration forms the letter N. Next to the woman is O-N-N-E, and it means nun. And it actually means, it's nonna in Latin, but it's a wordplay. It's wordplay on a nun. And so it's quite likely this manuscript was written by women, for women, really around the time that Emma and her husbands were in power. And what is remarkable in terms of the production of manuscripts is that when this manuscript, just about maybe 8 years ago, was rebound, you can see the process of the rebinding here at Cambridge University Library. And here it is in its new binding, very beautiful. This is the Salisbury Psalter, another illustrated page from it. What they found in the margins was a quill shaving fragment. So the last time that would have been touched, when they rebound it 8 years ago, the time prior to that when that quill shaving would have been touched would have been in about 970, 980, something like that. Just a really remarkable little find. And women, as Patricia said, are often not seen in the record, but there's more and more evidence coming to light to suggest how powerful women were in this period. And that really served to underscore Emma's role as queen with power of her own and her ability to make decisions for herself and on behalf of her husbands when she was acting as regent. You know, a recent find takes us to this idea of craft. This is a manuscript in the Fitzwilliam Museum. It's the Reichenau Epistolary. And you can see as a huge, I've done a really dramatic kind of close-up here, or at least I've acquired this from the little leaf on the left-hand side on the folio. There's this close-up of the ultramarine or the lapis lazuli that has gone to create that blue that you can see. And it's incredible that in a skeleton that was discovered really just a few years ago and written about just a few years ago in science magazines, this nun whose body was recovered from Reichenau nunnery, monastery, had this is her jawbone, and it has, and you may have read about this, it has a piece of lapis lazuli firmly embedded behind the main teeth at the front there, which suggests that she was using the pigment and perhaps using a brush and cleaning the brush with her teeth with her saliva, and then putting the pigment, crushing it, putting it into a form where it could be used in an image like you've just seen. So the expense, the skill, the production and ownership of books by and for women is confirmed by books like this, which is the Gospel Book of Judith of Flanders. It's roughly contemporary with Emma and Knut, just a little bit later, with its treasure binding of gems and jewels. And this Gospel book was owned by Judith, Countess of Flanders, And all of these illuminations would have had these silk curtains over them. Most have been lost, but this one is still in situ, in order to protect the illumination on facing pages like this. These extraordinary manuscripts were very dear to the women and the men, the noble women usually, aristocratic nuns, queens, duchesses, countesses. They were incredibly important for their spiritual well-being, but also as testimony to the affluence and erudition, learning of these women. And I'm not sure that there's any reason for us to doubt that women could access the written word in these books, at least these educated, aristocratic women, who, as Patricia's already explained, were very often bi or tri or multilingual, and could operate on stages throughout Europe, as Emma, in fact, did. So this is another gospel book. This belonged to Queen Margaret of Scotland. And again, you can see how important it was to this female reader to have this book. I mean, in the case of this book, it actually fell into water, it fell into a stream, but they managed to retrieve it, and miraculously it wasn't damaged in any way. But this then takes us thinking about patronage of the arts and commissioning of these books. And it takes us straight, of course, to Emma and that image that we've already seen of Emma and Canute in London British Library, Stowe manuscript 944, from around 1030, 1031. It's the image on the left that we're concerned with, and this dedication of this enormous golden cross to Winchester. And we see Canute being crowned on the right-hand side, and he's directly standing beneath St. Peter, who has the keys to heaven. The cross is obviously beneath God, Christ, God, in his mandala. And on the left-hand side, as we're looking at it, and touching the frame, is the Virgin Mary in the top register, holding a book. And then beneath her is an angel who is veiling Emma, who's the woman at the left, gathering her skirts and reaching out. Looks like she's reaching out to touch the cross. She's not touching the cross because women were not permitted, I think, to actually touch the altar in the medieval period. And if she touched the cross, she's inadvertently touching the altar because it's sitting on the altar. But this is an absolutely remarkable thing. It's an image, it's a picture that we see an awful lot in books and discussions of Emma. To have one portrait of a queen that's contemporary in this period is unheard of. To have two, as we have, because there's also the one in the encomium, is utterly unique. And that alone testifies to the power of this Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Scandinavian queen, who has these portraits created contemporaneously of her. And we must know that they knew about this image and that this image reflects something they wanted reflected. There's no doubt, there's no reason to doubt that. In the case of Canute, on the right-hand side here, this Viking king who's been crowned by St. Peter, despite the fact that the Vikings themselves were not entirely Christian at this time. He's got his hand on the cross in that really dramatic statement of authority, but his sword, note, a Viking sword, pierces the frame as if to say, there is that threat of violence. His hand is on his sword and the sword is outside the frame of this image. And so she, Emma on the left, really balances Canute's kind of aggression on the right. And she, of course, as I say, sits directly beneath the Virgin Mary and the angel in this image of secular power in the case of Emma and celestial power in the case of the Virgin Mary. And the importance of the veil, I think we'll talk about that towards the closing of this talk. Now, this manuscript is an extraordinary survival, and it contains not just that image of Canute, it also contains the will of King Alfred, it contains resting places of saints, and it also contains lists and lists and lists of names, kind of scurrying about the page, like a kind of giant graveyard of competing names wanting to be read out by the monks in confraternity. So this is called Liber Vitae, a book of life, because you enter into it the names of those who are affiliated with your institution, in this case, Winchester. And of course, and I actually find this incredibly moving, this desire to be made immortal through the writing of your name in a book. But it's also very respectful, despite the fact that there's this crowding of names. I have found no instances where somebody has erased a name in order to write their own, or in fact really overwritten a name. It's just it's an extraordinary thing. Knut's name, of course, appears, and he is the pious Pius et Regiolosus Rex Anglorum, the most pious and religious of kings, of English kings. So they knew what they were doing in donating that cross to Winchester. And of course, as we heard, they donated many other relics and gifts. And they were known for their production of gospel books, not their own production, for fostering and patronizing the production of gospel books. And there's some wonderful writing by scholars such as T.A. Heslop on the manuscripts that Knut and Emma had made or had altered and improved in the 1020s so that they could give these books as gifts to bishops like Bishop Wulfstan of York, to prelates, and to other institutions. This is one example, the Grimball Gospels, that we know was patronized by Knut and Emma. And there's other documentary evidence of their commissioning of these books. And this is the Gospel book Arundel 155, which was also put together and patronized by Knut and Emma. And you can see on the right-hand side of this illumination, there's a little figure prostrate on the floor in a brown habit. And that is likely to be the scribe of the book, and possibly the illustrator too, who's known as Eadwig Basan, which means Eadwig the Fat, who was the monk, very much working alongside Knut and Emma in the production of a significant number of these kinds of illuminated, gold, richly adorned gospel books for gifts to others, to enhance their piety and their renown for being devoted Christian king and queen. And so Knut, we're told by the encomiast in the Encomium Emma Regina, went around donating gifts to institutions, and this is Saint-Bertin in the Low Countries. He goes there en route to Rome when he goes to Rome in 1027, as we heard, and we're not sure, as Patricia said, if Emma went with him or not. But we learn that he advanced humbly towards all of the altars in Saint-Bertin with complete concentration, the encomiast tells us. He prayed for the intercession of the saints in a manner wonderfully reverend. And then at length, when he gave the sign, his offering, he has this gift, which could have been a small cross, a big cross. It was presented to him by his followers, not a mean one, nor such as might be shut in any bag, but a man brought it, the offering, huge as it was, in the ample fold of his cloak, and this the king himself placed on the altar with his own hand, the cheerful giver, according to the apostolic exhortation. And then Knut goes around sobbing, tearful, in floods of tears, this pious pilgrim en route to Rome, just after, let me tell you, having murdered his brother-in-law in Norway for beating him at a game of chess. So right after he commits fratricide, he then becomes the pious, penitent, sobbing at altars as he goes down to the crowning of the Holy Roman Emperor. So a remarkably deft, nimble kind of cleverness about the ways in which Knut and Emma had themselves portrayed, in the hope that the record would show them favourably. Knut also gave the Arenberg Gospels to Deutz, and this is one of these Gospels that I'm talking about as having been patronised by him and Emma, as well as the staff of St. Heribert, which is made of walrus, ivory, and silver, and is really an incredible, beautiful object. And you'll notice on the back that the nimbed Christ with the angels on the left and the right-hand side, and the register beneath it is reminiscent of that frontispiece to the Stowe 944 manuscript with Knut and Emma. So recording deeds, as the encomiast does, he says, I endeavour to transmit to posterity in my writings the memory of the deeds I've done, of the things that concern your honour and those of yours. Recording deeds was so important to these incredibly adept, proficient monarchs. And in having the encomium written, as she did in 1041, 1042, Emma was trying to ensure both her own dynasty, her marriage to Canute, the record of Canute's reign, and to provide for the whole of history, an account of things as she would like them to be remembered. And it's really such an incredible, it's a very tiny little book, and look how sort of spaced out the writing is. And again, here's this portrait of her on the left. It's a really incredible survival that's only very recently, I think, begun to be studied in the sympathetic and appreciative way that it really should be. Because whatever else we think of Emma, there's no doubt that she was an incredibly powerful and strong queen. And it wasn't just in England that she was a powerful and strong queen through 2 reigns, and actually into the reigns of her sons, of course, so for a very long time after Canute's death. But it's also on the European stage. We could think of her as an international politician, an international aristocrat. That is really how we should think of her. Not just as British or Norman, but actually with a much wider reach. Because if you look at this image and its close-up, oh, that's annoying. Okay, its image and its close-up. And you look at the curtains and you look at the peeping sons on the right-hand side and the encomiast kneeling and presenting her with this book, this representation of the encomium itself. It's reminiscent of Otto III, the Holy Roman Emperor, from 996 to 1002, being offered his prayer book by the cleric on the right-hand side there. Those curtains, the square crown. It's all reminiscent of this imperial iconography, and it's what is resonant in the encomiastic preface that we've just seen. And the image really has such striking similarities that it must have been known to Emma when she commissioned that portrait. And so she really is trying to situate herself within the sphere of the Holy Roman Empire, perhaps as an imperial figure in her own right. Canute, of course, was king of, as Patricia said, not just England, but Denmark, parts of Sweden, Norway. And in that, himself had a kind of empire that he might have been attempting to match, if you like, the Holy Roman Emperor. And then in these other Byzantine-inspired Holy Roman Empire ivory plaques, this one here of Theophanu and Otto II, the parents of Otto III, or in this panel, you can see that kind of register that we saw in the frontispiece to Stowe 944 of Canute and Emma, with these different registers from heaven to earth and the upholding of the monarchs, in such a way that I think it allows us to say that there's no doubt that in the reign of Canute, and particularly in the long life of Emma, we see moving up the archetype of excellent, astonishing political propaganda, but also powerful piety at play in the production and propagation of the Christian message. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Treharne, for truly illuminating these manuscripts for us, what they mean, and decoding all of this. It's these works of, as you said, incredible importance and representing incredible wealth, tell us so much about Emma and the time that she lived in. And now we have a number of really interesting questions. I'm going to try to get through all of them. Thank you, George, for doing this. And our panel, Shira Kamen, Patricia Bracewell, and Elaine Treharne, I'm going to ask them a series of questions about Emma. Oh, and another one just came in. Hey. Oh, okay. So let me start with something contemporary. This was used, I think, in some of our promotion. How accurate was the portrayal of Emma in the Netflix series Vikings Valhalla?
Oh, dear God. Not at all. The first season was okay. it did show her as being a queen, as having problems when Canute came in. She was trying to protect her children, and that was all fine. And then in the second season, they kind of went crazy. And had her doing all kinds of things that, there was, when Emma was married to Canute, there was not a lot of conflict that she had to deal with. So they had to make it up. And so they made up conflict that really did not fit the character or the history at all. Elaine, do you want to respond to that? Did you see it?
I did see it. I think I saw it. It's pretty bad, but it's not as bad as that one that's just been on the.
Oh my God, King and Conqueror was horrible.
Okay.
Yeah. So they're varying degrees of badness, but they got some of the language right in Vikings, and so that was just a pleasure to see happen. Yeah.
So here's another history and into contemporary arts question to start off. Was Ragna in Ken Follett's books fiction coming over in 997 from Normandy? Do we know the answer on that one? Ragna in Ken Follett's books, did he really come over from Normandy in 997?
He might have.
Okay, all right. So there's a good maybe there. Question for Patricia. This is kind of a two-part question. To asking what led to your falling in love with telling Emma of Normandy's story, and can you tell us anything about your forthcoming fourth book about Emma?
I fell in love with Emma because I was looking for a historical woman who had not been written about over and over and over again. And when I first discovered Emma, I found a reference to her online and found out that she was the daughter of the Duke of Normandy and the sister of the Duke of Normandy, and married to two kings and the mother of two kings. I thought, I wonder why I've never heard of her. And so I decided to write a book about her, and I ended up writing 3. The fourth book is coming along, and I have to say I was thrilled to listen to Elaine talk about that scene where Canute presents this gift when he's in Flanders. He's on his way to Rome, and he's in Flanders, and he puts something on the altar, and it's a special gift. And I actually have that scene in book 4. So that's kind of a thrill. When you can actually show something that you know happened, that's in the history, and you can incorporate it into the fiction that you're writing, it's really pretty exciting.
Thank you. This is now a question for Elaine. Even though the monastic labor was probably unpaid, the medieval manuscripts were very expensive. So could you compare their cost to the other possessions of the time? For example, was a manuscript worth 10 horses or half a castle? Or and also, the writing was often so small, how did people read them without glasses?
Yes, those are very good questions. There's a lot about the economics of book production that we don't fully know the answers to, and those are beginning to be gradually revealed by new technologies that allow us to ascertain the materials that are being used, the types of skin that are being used, where that skin came from. So the fact that books look like they were produced in, let's say, the northeast of England in the 8th century, but in fact, while they were produced there, the materials came from Italy. Right? So we learn a lot about trade and commerce. And the Lichfield Gospels, which is a beautifully illuminated gospel book, probably from Llandilo in Wales, but now at Lichfield Cathedral, I think the brothers who acquired it gave horses and property for it. So the cost of books was very significant and would have been on a par with any of the finest treasures. The finest gospel books would have been on a par with the finest treasures. There were many more workaday books than that, but it was always an expensive process. The same is true right the way through the Middle Ages, really right up until, I suppose, the invention of print really in the West in the 15th century. What was the second part of the question? Sorry.
Oh, that the writing was so small, how did people read it without glasses?
So I have a theory about this that I am sure is right. Rock crystal. If you've seen the Alfred jewel in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, you will know that this enameled depiction of a king is covered with rock crystal, which has been sharpened, and it's in cabochon, so it's a smooth surface. Rock crystal acts as a magnifying glass. And so that is what I believe they would use to discern the smallest handwriting, which could be, truly minuscule. Because glasses obviously weren't invented until Umberto Eco tells us in The Name of the Rose, I think it's the 13th century.
Thank you. Now, question for Shira, also with two parts. To ask, this person kindly thanked us for the music that we brought here, but how much time did we have to spend learning the Old English, how to pronounce that? And how did you start specializing in medieval music?
A fine question. The first part of that question is an embarrassingly small amount of time we had because of the way that life is. We were lucky to hear a beautiful speaker, Phyllis. I can't remember her last name. She if you Google YouTube, Wife's Lament, Exeter book. She reads it, and so almost everything we got from the way she pronounced it, because she speaks very beautifully and very cleanly and talks about the poem. I have not dealt with Old English. I've dealt with a lot of Middle English and other medieval languages, but this is earlier than my usual area. And but I don't know if any of you have experienced Ben Bagby's Beowulf. He spent so much of his life dealing with that text, and he has 90 minutes of it memorized and sung, spoken, and it's just absolutely extraordinary. So that is an inspiration of all kinds. The other thing, medieval music. Oh, gosh. I'm a classical music escapee, and I still love classical music, but I got very intrigued with earlier music. Could be because my dad sang at the Renaissance Fair, in tights and a Robin Hood hat with the Oakland Symphony Chamber Chorus, and that made an impression on me. And when I was 6, I got to hold the sign for the chorus, and I thought that was pretty great. But my taste just got earlier and earlier, and I liked very much the kinds of things that you need to hone and work on in medieval music are a lot of the things that we were not taught in classical music. Things like, there's no part for you, what are you going to do about that? Or not taking music completely literally, there's no bowings marked in, you don't match them with anybody. Hardly anybody's dealt with a lot of these pieces anyway. And so I think I just got more and more intrigued with that aspect of it, the jigsaw puzzle part of it. But also, I really like traditional music of many flavors, and it felt like medieval music combined the musical modes that I like that are from, I'm going to say, folk music, combining with kind of the high art of these very structured poems. And the music we have from the court and the church they're pretty high class. And so I like that they meet somewhere in the middle of these two different kinds of textures. It's good, wholesome fun.
Yeah. So here's a question about education for all of you to speak to. What were the lives of the common people like at this time? Were they educated at all? And what was women's education like? Whoever would like to address that.
Well, we know that Alfred instituted the first, I would call it a college, a school in Winchester during his reign. And I don't know what level that went down to, but we have some books in Old English where it's a back and forth between the teacher and the student, and they're learning to write, they're learning Latin, or they're learning not Old English, but they're learning Latin. So it's back and forth between the teacher and the student. So we know that there was some learning. These were probably noble sons, I would guess. And when it came down to, the serfs, the people who tilled the land, they didn't have a lot of time to do any reading or any learning. That's my understanding of it. It was something that was at the noble level and not the basic serfs. That's why you have the windows in the cathedrals told stories, because that was how people learned their Bible. They learned the stories of the Bible and of the saints through those images in the cathedrals.
Elaine?
Elaine?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. Although, you know, it depends how you define education. If you mean one defines it. If you mean specifically literacy, then most people, the majority, wouldn't have had access to writing really until the sort of end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th century, when literacy became rather more widespread. But even then, formal education was not for any other than the nobles, aristocrats, and the church people. But women were educated when they went into religious life, or if they were aristocratic women, they would have been educated. Quite what that extended to, one is not sure. Certainly reading, if not writing, because reading comes first and writing is a separate skill that's acquired subsequently. But the problem that we have is not necessarily that the sources are not explicit about this, but the fact that we have inherited, please forgive me here, but we've inherited 250 years of a kind of misogynistic, patriarchal account of women's ineptitude in this period, and we have to get through all of that. We have to wade through all of that before we can allow the sources to speak for themselves. And the work that a novelist like Patricia does can be as important, because it brings life to these people of 1,000 years ago in a way that the sources often don't explicitly. But if we listened more carefully, we would hear a far fairer picture than has been permitted so far.
Thank you. The Humanities West audience, I know, has a lot of people who like to travel, and so there's a question about whether or not you have to be a scholar to gain access to the illuminated manuscripts in the British Library for your next trip to England.
I do
You can
not
go.
know.
No, you can go to the Ritblat Gallery of Treasures, and you can see the Lindisfarne Gospels, whatever gospel books they've got on display, the St. John's Gospel of Cuthbert, Beowulf. So you can see those there, and often the manuscripts are on display in the cathedral libraries. But if you want to sit and study it, you generally need a letter of introduction and a particular reason for doing it. However, if you type in digitized manuscripts, every major repository has some digitized manuscripts you can look at in glorious color online, folio by folio. So the British Library got hacked, and so many of its images are not there for the last 2.5, nearly 3 years now. But Parker Corpus, there's lots. If anybody's interested, just look up digitized manuscripts. And also we have manuscripts at Stanford, and we regularly have open houses where anyone can come and look at these materials with me and Dr. Benjamin Albritton. So there is a way to find this stuff.
When is the next open house?
Probably when I'm not on sabbatical, so autumn quarter.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to add to that, Pat? Okay. So here's a question for Shira. What do we know about the courtly music from this era? And how do we know much about it, if we do?
Well, from this very era, I don't think we know much. Anything that we have is going to be from probably a tale that might describe somebody singing or playing. But I don't know. We have a lot of later sources where it will say, there was a singer, and the singer sang the lay of such and such, and then the viol player played exactly what the singer had sung. So we have little things like that. But as far as actually what was happening in those courts, I imagine music's always been important. It's always been important in courtly settings. It's been important in church settings. That, of course, is where we have any information that we have is from those places. This is hearkening back for one moment to that previous question about education. I was thinking about music education back then, and how we really just don't know what the music of the people are. We want to have the music of the marketplace or the music of the the peasants, but the best we can really do is probably the music of the courtly people playing it being peasants. So as far as this period, I don't know. I know there are a few instruments, a few lyres that are left, a lot of what seems to be, I'm going to say, like Sprechstimme sort of stuff, like oratory where you're half singing and half speaking, but we don't have, as far as I know, we don't have anything that we can look at.
Okay, this is a question kind of interesting, especially given the wonderful chronology that Pat went through in her talk. Please say more about all these deaths. They seem a bit suspicious.
I kind of suspected that might come up. You could die of a lot of things in the 11th century. But when a king died, or a noble died, or a king's son died, there would always be this tension. It was a nervous time. How did they die? And of course, there are stories that Edmund Ironside died because someone shot an arrow at him while he was relieving himself in the privy. Not my favorite story.
I hate when that happens.
And we see that that comes from some other that it's not just Edmund that story is tied to. But there has been, in terms of Canute and his sons, they all died quite young. And there's been a Danish, I forget his name, a Danish doctor who theorized that there might have been a genetic issue among Canute and his two sons, and that, or not just his two sons, all three of his sons, and that they suffered from a heart issue that caused death without any real warning. Now, we know that Harthacnut died while he was at a wedding, that he was drinking at a wedding and he fell down and he never spoke again. He was alive for a few days and then he died after that. So that's hard to know. We know nothing about Harold Harefoot. We know nothing about Canute's son, Sven, who died in Denmark. I'm a novelist. I make things up. And so when we don't know how he died, oh, good, here's a chance to make things up. And I have a pathologist who lives down the street from me, and I go to him and I say, okay, I need another weird way for somebody to die from the 11th century. So that's all part of the putting together a story.
Elaine, did you want to add to that? Okay.
No, but isn't that great to hear? I love that.
So just a couple more questions here, and next one is for Elaine. In seeking salvation through the wisdom in the manuscripts, were the monks aware of the poisonous nature of some of the materials, and did they just accept those risks, or maybe it helped bring them closer to heaven?
Quicker, anyway.
Or faster?
Well, I should think they were aware if they, after a period of time, they learned very quickly. So after a period of time working on a manuscript, if the scribes or the illuminators were just keeling over, I think they would have put two and two together. And you're making me think of The Name of the Rose. So if anybody has not read that yet, you must read it. I think they were, they were aware of the dangers, and I think they were mitigating methods that they could use to make sure that they weren't ingesting the toxic materials. And of course, training was kind of passed on. I mean, these were very highly educated and highly trained individuals. And by the 12th century, the artists themselves were professionals moving around the monasteries, not even necessarily part of the monastic brotherhood. So they would most certainly have known. And there are some what would you call them, treatises of working with materials for colours in the higher Middle Ages. So yes, did they think this brought them closer to God, not just the risk? The risks were great because they were in the same position. Scribes talk about how hard and arduous this work was, especially through sort of cold, brutal Northern European weather. Just the process of writing was certainly a step up the ladder of grace. And scribes would begin their work in the mornings, often with a prayer. And some of those, very occasionally, those prayers still exist So they did think of this work absolutely as part of the Opus Dei, the work of God, and it was, it was a renowned activity.
Elaine, there was one of your first images that you showed when they were talking about how they made the manuscripts, and there was one monk who was the one that who was supposedly drawing himself, and he had some sort of implement that he actually had it on. I thought that I've never seen that before, and I thought that was really interesting.
It's kind of like a little tea tray on a stem, right? It's like you can buy those things so you can have your dinner in front of the television. Something like that. So they're portable workstations.
Yeah, and it's an indication to me that that's something I think about over and over and over. They knew how to do things back in the 11th century that we don't give them credit for. And the more you study them, the more you find out, oh, they were pretty clever. They knew how to do stuff. So,
Well, speaking of knowing how to do things, why, as we saw in, I think, one of the manuscripts, why is Canut's name spelled C-N-U-T and not K-N-U-T?
your guess is as good as mine.
They didn't really have K in the English alphabet. It comes that you only generally see it really by the time we get into the 12th century. It comes from the Romance languages. So the Anglo-Saxon way of spelling it would be with a C, Knut, and of course with a K in Old Norse with an R on the end, Knut. So there's many different, as we know, there are many different spellings of Canute, but C-N-U-T is fine.
And an interesting final question, someone asked if, a question for me, which is really nice, does Humanities West look anything like I imagined it after 43 years and 125 programs that we have recorded? No. Because the idea of something lasting for 43 years when you're a graduate student and you're doing this for your thesis is, it's simply beyond even thinking about. But I think that many of you know that virtually all of our programs, going back to 1984, including that 1984 program that Shira is playing on, are available on our website. Many of them are just the sound recording, because of course it's like in the days before there was easy video recording, but a number of them are also recorded with the video. So when an art historian or someone like Elaine has got beautiful visuals, you can see the visuals as well. So if there's something from pretty much ancient Egypt to the Vietnam War, we cover the gamut, and you can just go to the website and look under the part about the programs and find something that you're interested in, listen to an interesting lecturer. And so it's very exciting to see this. And there's one more question.
The veil. Get back to the veil.
Oh, the veil.
Never talked about the veil.
Yes, you said something, and we'll get back to that later, but we didn't. So, Elaine, tell us about the veil. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. All I was going to say is note the veil, because when the encomiast presents the book to Emma, his hand is veiled. So in that image, he presents the book to her with his hand covered by the veil, as in the sort of veil of the Holy Tabernacle, etc. It's the sanctity of the book of her life. So that book is portrayed as a sacred object, which, what does that say about her? I'll leave you to fill in the gaps there, but thank you. That was the significance of the veil. His veiled
We got that
hand.
in here. So,
Very good.
thank you for all of these wonderful questions, and I want to say thank you, Elaine, for truly bringing these unbelievable manuscripts to life. I hope when folks travel and get to see them, or perhaps come to the open house at Stanford, they get to explore them a little bit more. Thank you, Pat, for bringing this amazing woman, to my attention and to life. There are going to be books for sale, of course, out in the foyer after this. And thank you, Shira, for making the interdisciplinary part of this the music of near her era, so that you could hear the Old English. It's really what Humanities West is all about, is pulling these together about interesting people, places, and periods. And we're so grateful to have had the opportunity to do this. Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Shira.
Thank you, Teresa.
And I believe we'll see you perhaps at our next program, which is about the Etruscans. And it coincides with the big Etruscan exhibit that will be at the Fine Arts Museum. So watch your email for that.